Thank you very much, and sorry for the slight delay. My name is Suvendrini Kakuchi. I'll be your moderator today. Let me introduce our guest, Mr. Willem Adema. He's a senior economist and specialist on family and children policies at the OECD. He presents to us a new document, Society at a Glance, Asia-Pacific 2014, in which he will present findings on gender, employment, education, social protection, poverty, and health in the region. What is, of course, most interesting to journalists is, of course, how Mr. Adema sees Japan faring against the other countries in the region. Briefly, Mr. Adema graduated from Erasmus University in Rotterdam and holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. He was also head of a section in the OECD that looks at reconciliation of work and family, very pertinent today. So without much ado, let me hand over the mic to Mr. Adema. Thank you again, everyone, for coming.
Indeed, thank you very much for coming. I'm surprised there are so many here, and I'm planning to give a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not sure if there is a. You've handed out the slides, is that it? Right? So we do it like that. We go through the slides as they have been handed out, and there is a. The occasion is the release of Society at a Glance Asia Pacific. I'm not sure how familiar you are with OECD work. In 2000-2001, the first edition of Society at a Glance for OECD countries came out, and it was the first attempt to present a range of evidence on socio-economic trends in societies. We have, in recent years, focused also on the Asia-Pacific region and try to put together indicators which cover countries in this particular region. The volume which is lying in front of you today, Society at a Glance Asia-Pacific 2014, is the third such an edition. The OECD produces its standard Society at a Glance book every other year. So that's that. The other thing which you may wish to know, when I was young and innocent, in the early 2000s, I was editor and leader of a team which visited Japan in the context of what we then called the so-called Babies and Bosses reviews. And that looked at the issues around work and family reconciliation. So the issue which is playing out in the debate today has been at least our attention for a long, long time. But way back in the early 2000s, there was far less interest in Japan in these issues than there is now, as your presence here shows. So I can see a considerable change in that regard. Let me just quickly try to go through the publication, give you some other background. If you look at the slide, so to speak, on the first page at the bottom with the table of contents, it shows you that we have sort of 5 standard chapters in which we present indicators, context, self-sufficiency, equity, health, and social cohesion. This is a range of indicators from fertility rates, GDP, poverty statistics, education spending, attainment, PISA scores. So that is all included in those various chapters. I will leave you to that. And then we have 2 special chapters in this year's edition. One on gender equality and one on social protection. The one on gender equality comes out of work we did for the OECD as a whole in the 2010-2012 period, and we produced a book called Closing the Gender Gap Act Now, which gives you a range of indicators and analysis on gender inequalities across the OECD in a range of issues. That was 2012. That stuff is being updated, and we will pick that up again because in 2013 the OECD accepted a gender recommendation which includes a list of measures which promote gender equality in the areas of education, employment and entrepreneurship. And that also stipulated that we had to report back on progress made in the area of gender equality in 2017. The main list of measures promoted in terms of gender equality in the OECD gender recommendation is actually in Annex 2 of the Society at a Glance Asia Pacific version. The other thing worth of note is when it comes to social protection, we have been working together with the ILO and the Asian Development Bank to try and pull some numbers, some credible numbers together on social protection expenditure across the region. The general issue is, of course, that while OECD countries, full members of the OECD, are duty-bound to report their statistics to the OECD, other countries, non-member countries, including those in Asia-Pacific, do not have such an obligation. So, inevitably, by nature, the quality of data sets is less comprehensive than what we get from our own member countries, because we have a greater power to ask for more detailed information. So in the presentation, which I'm about to go through with you now, there are some slides some data which are not in Society Asia at a Glance Pacific, for that very reason, because we simply lack the indicators to show the same thing for the region. Key point of the story, and also key point of the OECD gender work, was that if you look at the data, if you look at the trends over the last 50 years, then when it comes to economic growth, that is strongly related, 50% of that growth is strongly related to gains in educational attainment across the OECD made over those 50 years. And of course that is strongly related to the gains that women have made in female educational attainment. So if you look at the proportion of adults, and that's the first slide, who have a university degree in Asia Pacific countries, then you will see that in most countries men are more likely to have a tertiary degree than women. For the OECD, on average, it's sort of the same. And when you look at countries like Australia and New Zealand, women have already overtaken men in this regard when you look at the whole adult population. In most other countries, women still lag behind. But that is changing for younger generations. And that's that you can sort of see looking at the slide with PISA scores, which is underneath. In terms of levels, which is in the book, not on the slides here, PISA scores in Shanghai, China, in Hong Kong, China, in Japan, are above the OECD average. In that sense, people in these economies are doing very well, young people in these economies. When you look at the gender perspective, which is in the chart I've included here, which shows boys minus girls scores. So if girls do considerably better than boys, then the observation is well below the zero axis. You can see that in terms of reading literacy scores, girls invariably do considerably better than boys. In terms of science literacy scores, test scores, the differences between boys and girls are not all that great. And in maths, boys on average do slightly better than girls, but there isn't all that much in it. In comparison with the differences in reading literacy, these differences are very small. So on the whole, girls at age 15, 16 do better at school than boys. And that's also reflected, excuse me for that, it's also reflected in when you look at educational attainment, not for the whole working age, but for the younger parts of the population. So when you look at educational attainment for those who are 24, 23, 25, 34, you can see that among that age group, women do better than men, and considerably so in some countries. And you can also see that the difference with the previous cohorts is enormous. So in Korea, younger women have made incredible strides in female educational attainment when you compare that with the cohort 45-54. And also in Japan, the differences are significant. So in that sense, across the OECD and across the younger age group, young women are better educated than young men. There is one area where differences remain considerable, and that's the area of field of study, the topics young women pursue when they engage in tertiary education. And that's the subject of the chart underneath, and that shows that women are far more likely, young women are far more likely than young men to engage, to undertake a study in terms of in the humanities, or in the arts, or in health, or in welfare studies. Whereas when it comes to computer studies, science, engineering, it is still very much young men who take up such studies. So that is remains a key difference, and that is related to attitudes, to culture. As we've just seen, when it comes to scores, when it comes to ability, at around age 15, 16, the differences aren't all that large when it comes to science and mathematics. The differences are actually fairly small. But so there are the huge gap in educational choices when you go to university are related to something else, are related not so much to ability, but to attitudes, to expectations around you, to peer pressure perhaps. So that is an important issue to address. And we'll come back to that at the end. I don't want to talk too long, so I better take my watch off and keep an eye on myself. The next thing is, the next issue is that all these gains in educational attainment and these changes in education outcomes have not yet translated into dramatic changes in labor market outcomes. As you can see from the charts which I've put together here, across the Asia Pacific, but the story would be the same as in the OECD, and it is for the OECD average here in the chart. Labor force participation rates for men are higher than for women. The gaps would be closest in OECD countries like Sweden and Norway. Here you can see that they're relatively close for the poorest countries, where men and women, regardless of whatever else, will have to participate in the labor market to get by, and which helps to explain the small labor force participation gaps in Laos and Papua New Guinea. Whereas in other countries, and particularly Pakistan, there are huge cultural issues make sure or lead to relatively few women participating in the labor force. So labor force participation gaps are huge in South Asia in particular. Other than participation, in terms of the quality of the jobs the women are in, they are much more likely to be in informal employment. They are much more likely, as one of the charts here shows, to be in part-time employment. They are less likely to be in leadership positions. The chart here shows the share of women in parliament, 2005 and 2010. Well, across parliaments, across Asia Pacific and also across the OECD, in the Asia Pacific, the average is around 15 to 20%. In the OECD, it's around 20 to 25%. But regardless of all of that, women are in the minority in parliaments. What you can see is from this chart is that in certain countries there's been a considerable jump up in the numbers. Bangladesh, Cambodia. These countries have introduced a quota. And in Bangladesh, on top of my head, it is, I think, 50 women out of a 350-seat parliament. And that refers to a wider issue, which is not just when it concerns parliamentary representation, but also when it concerns women on boards, women in senior management of private companies. There's a whole debate in OECD countries, and particularly in Europe, about whether governments should make compulsory that a certain board membership is specified by gender. And there are now 8 countries in Europe which have introduced such quota. The first one was Norway, which specified that 40% of the seats on board should be occupied by one or the other gender. But certain countries do not want to go that way. I have some difficulty imagining that this would fit into the Japanese policy setup. But the Japanese government and many other governments are urging companies to disclose the composition of their leadership at the top and in middle management, just to show what is going on and whether any changes are taking place. So, and then the story is about setting targets, disclosure requirements, and in general generating initiatives within the private sector to make sure that more women get into senior positions. Myself, I think that governments are quite rightly fairly reluctant to intervene in labor market institutions. These are areas where social partners play a great role. But leadership is key. And government can engage with leadership of companies to get leaders to set the example. But not only that, to get middle managers on board to generate change. And to translate that into the Japanese perspective, right, there's still a lot of, if you want to generate change, there's still a lot of unpaid overtime going on. There's still a lot of workers in regular employment who do not take their full leave entitlement, or who stay in late into the office, or and then there's certainly not many men who make use of their parental leave entitlement. So if you want to generate change, you can ask your senior or middle managers to and make them accountable for change, saying, right, you are responsible if your staff doesn't take their full holiday entitlement, or if they don't, if they stay in the office beyond 7 o'clock, or any kind of measure. If you make if you engage your middle management in change, that will be very important. Anyway, because women are generally in weaker positions in the labour market, there remains considerable gender pay gaps across the OECD. As you can see from the chart, across the OECD, on average, at the median earnings, gender pay differences are 15%. The good news is that they have come down since the 2000, but as you can see, in the Asian and member countries of the OECD, gender pay gaps are most persistent and amount to 25-30% in Japan and Korea, and these are considerable differences, and they are also related to the very dual labor market, dualized labor market in Japan, where you have remarkable differences in employment conditions between regular and non-regular workers, and these have a strong bearing on gender pay differences, because many men are predominantly in regular employment, whereas there are more women in non-regular employment conditions. We have data on Asian Pacific countries, but these are slightly different. They concern average earnings. I am a bit I'm not so convinced by the quality, because sometimes this concerns urban surveys. So the coverage of the samples is limited. So I haven't used the levels. I've presented the trends in society at a glance Asia Pacific, which are often not dissimilar to what's going on in OECD countries. In terms of the statistics on entrepreneurship, that's another issue. Women are less likely to be entrepreneurs than men, except in very poor countries where out of economic necessity entrepreneurship is often chosen. Micro-entrepreneurship is often only a realistic prospect. Another indicator, which is actually important, is the indicator on time use I've presented in the book and in this presentation. And then it goes, it's about unpaid work, engagement in unpaid work. And you can see that women across the Asia region, but also, and that also applies to the OECD, women are far more likely to spend time on unpaid work, and then I'm talking about care work for children or the elderly, unpaid work around the house, than men do. You can also see here then the gap is relatively small in New Zealand. It would be even smaller in countries like Norway and Sweden. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, that the countries which have the smallest gap, the smallest gender gap in time spent on unpaid work, are also the countries with the smallest gap in time spent in paid work. So the high female participation rates in northern economies, in Nordic countries, is related to the fact that the husbands, the partners, actually do their fair share at home. Again, in Japan, Korea, other Asian countries, the contribution of men to unpaid housework is much lower. Long hours, socializing after work, long commutes, little time left to help out at home. So there is all these links between the workplace culture, time spent at home. These issues are linked. Now, apart from the issue of making a better use of the greater female talent pool and the increased female educational attainment over the last decades, the other reason, of course, why governments who look ahead, that traditionally is the definition of government, think that gender equality in labor market outcomes is a good idea is, of course, the unfolding demographic change. I've put here on the slides the population structures of Japan and China over the last 50 and for the next 50 years. And you can see that in Japan, the working age population is already shrinking. Not only is the fact that life expectancy has increased, which is a good thing, but combined with the persistently low fertility rates, the population is aging, but the proportion of children is getting lower. But in Japan, it's now to the extent that the working age population, as a share in the overall population, is declining. And that will happen, will start to happen in China and in Korea in about 5 to 10 years' time too. So that means that if employment rates, either male or female, remain unchanged, that labor supply will go down. And that's shown in the next chart. That's the last chart before I get to chapter 3. And the dark unbroken line shows that if the employment rates stay the same, the labor supply goes down. And and that's the broken black line in the charts. If the gender gap was reduced by 25% by 2025, that could mitigate the decline in labor supply to a considerable extent in Japan, in China, and also in Korea. Countries which are not aging as rapidly as Japan is, and then I'm thinking of the US and Australia, of course, do not have this added impetus to the economic case for greater gender equality. The other thing is, of course, is that Japan, in its labor market solutions, often does not rely on great migration streams, whereas that is, of course, a completely different issue in the US. Finally, in terms of my presentation, we also had a chapter in Society Asia at a Glance, Society at a Glance Asia Pacific. It's too long a title. On social spending, because those data are relatively new, and those data have been developed in combination with, in cooperation with the ILO and the Asian Development Bank in Manila. The first picture actually gives you the sort of global trend about world protection spending. It shows that 20% of the world population, basically in Western Europe and Northern America, and in Australia and New Zealand, spends 80% of the world world social protection expenditure. It also shows that social spending has become more important in the region between 1990 and 2010. The other chart below that gives you some long time trends for OECD countries, and it shows you, amongst other things, that Japan, which in 1960 spent 4 to 5% of its GDP on social protection, is at the moment over 20%, and now has caught up with the OECD average. And if you look, that is important when you look at the next chart on social spending in Asia Pacific. Compared to the Asian Pacific countries, Japan is the biggest social spender. It's at the OECD average. It's not the biggest social spender when it comes to the OECD, but for the Asia Pacific region, it clearly is so. And there's a whole lot of countries which spend less than 5% of GDP on social protection in the Asia region, which is the situation where Japan was in 50 years ago. If you look at the composition of spending in Japan, of social spending in Japan, most of it is related to aging, to pensions, and its a fair share is 10% of GDP, and health. In that sense, Japan is spending more than the OECD on average, which is not all that surprising because on average its population is older than across the OECD. The next chart I will leave. It's about comparisons of social spending in the sense that in Japan people pay very little tax over their benefit income. In Sweden and Denmark they do, and I have made a comparison which accounts for that. But I will, if there's anyone who wants to know more about this, I could talk about this for a long, long time, and we can chat afterwards. Last slide, I have put down some key messages to take away from this, and then with a focus on Japan. As said, large gains in the education area, but somehow the good PISA scores do not translate into greater participation in STEM areas, science, technology, maths. So if we want to have more women into these areas, we should make them more aware of the effect their educational choices that they make at age 16 to 18 has on their future career prospects. Because if you qualify in a STEM with a degree in a STEM area, your career prospects are better, and they should be made aware of that. But there's a bit of the cultures to change, and that of course is not just related to informing girls more about their choices, but also informing parents and teachers more about the effects of stereotyping. In terms of policy, in terms of childcare policy, the Japanese government makes considerable efforts. It could do more, as so many other OECD governments. Could it do more in terms of investing in capacity and quality of the system? It has a parental leave system, which provides for paid leave for a year. It has bonus months for the partner, the father to take. That is more modern than the provisions in my own country, the Netherlands. So in that sense, the system isn't too bad. It's just that the culture, the workplace culture, has an overriding impact because there's hardly any fathers who make use of these modern provisions which are there to be used. So again, social policy can be fairly modern, but it won't be effective unless labor market cultures change. And that's related to the long hours culture, socializing after work, the nature of remuneration systems, seniority, the commitment Japanese regular workers have, and of course the sharp difference between those in regular employment and those in non-regular employment, who get paid far less, but the regular employers who get paid better and who have a career, in return make a commitment to their firm by not taking their leave, making loads of unpaid hours of overtime, and that culture has to change to find a better work-life balance for both the man and the woman. I've said enough. Up to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 20 minutes for question and answer. Please come up to the microphone. Yes. Can you come up to the microphone? You have to identify yourself because we're taping. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm from the Belgian embassy. I don't know how much my government has itself done in this matter, but I was curious about the type of measures that can be done to promote a better gender equality, because most of the measures which are being taken, and even here in Japan, are about recommendations, trying to, soft measures. What are, in terms of more forceful measures, regulatory measures, what has already been done, and what is the trend within the OECD, or the state of acceptance of taking more regulatory measures to impose a better gender balance? Thank you.
I mean, in terms of policies, in many OECD countries, governments can directly intervene in the policies they run themselves. So when it comes to childcare, which is an extremely important measure in terms of gender equality, they can do a lot, and they can do that quite quickly. For example, in the Asian part of the world, in terms of policy, the relatively low fertility rate causes concern. So at some point in Korea, they must have thought, right, if we just invest in a childcare system like they have in Sweden, we get higher fertility rates. Now, it doesn't work like that. But within a 10-year period of time, they have rapidly expanded the capacity of their childcare system. So in such areas, and they're now about to do that in Germany, which is relatively new, particularly in the former western part of Germany. So policy has made that change, and then can generate change relatively quickly. When it comes to generating change in the labor market, it's much more difficult, because governments are very reluctant to interfere in an area which they traditionally regard as an area of responsibility for the social partners. And you can argue about the effective power of unions in different countries, but governments are very reluctant to be descriptive, prescriptive in the area of labor relations or labor market regulation. The whole women on boards debate, the quota debate, is an illustration of that. There's now 8 countries which have legal provision in that area. Norway was the first. Germany, I think, is the most recent, but it's not even effective in Germany yet. It will be introduced in 2016. As from 2016, companies will have to, and that shows how reluctant companies are in this area, and there are huge differences between governments. So whereas the Norwegians have moved in the mid-2000s with this quota, the Swedes have not. So then it comes to trying to encourage and try to get disclosure regulations in company reports, enforce listed companies to provide information on the number of women on senior level and middle management, etc. The other thing governments can do is the change in parental leave legislation. By now, about in 2013, 11 OECD countries had paid leave arrangements for fathers, i.e. bonus months or daddy quotas, for fathers to take leave around the birth of their children. And so that has been expanded. 10 years ago, there was only a few countries. Korea now has introduced it. Japan has it. France is tinkering with it. But again, it takes some time before these things are being used, and in Japan, use is limited. It can go very quickly. Iceland, the idea that men in Scandinavia are modern is a myth. Before 2001, before reform in 2000, 3% of the parental leave days in Iceland was taken by men. And then they introduced a quota. They reserved 3 months for men at a relatively highly paid level. And all of a sudden it shot up to 33% of the parental leave days. So you need strong financial incentives as well. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Anybody else? Oh. Yes, please.
I speak for little freelancer from Germany. In the first part, you said about education, women better learning better than boys at school. I think in Germany there is a discussion about it that only few male teachers is not good for children at school. They should have male students should have more male teacher to improve the education of male students, because male students need a kind of identification figure, a man as an identification figure, not a woman. What is this? Is this only a German discussion, or what is how do you see it?
In terms of in working on gender equality, this was actually one of the areas which was very interesting, because boys are falling behind in secondary education, and the biggest issue or one of the biggest issues in education in Nordic countries is the high dropout rates among boys in secondary school. So when you talk about gender, when we set up the gender initiative, there was a debate saying about, should we call it gender equality or should we call it women empowerment? And the Swedes said, no. It has to be about gender equality, because our boys are doing worse in school than our girls. So that issue is a big issue in Nordic countries and in some other European countries too. I'm not sure about immediate solutions to that. The issue about getting more men into teaching because it provides role models is one which emerges in the Dutch policy debate from time to time. I'm sure it would appear in Nordic countries too. But yeah, the salaries in the private sector are often considerably higher than in the teaching profession. I mean, in terms of work-life balance, that is an issue. Women often select themselves into occupations, areas where the working hours are more conducive to caring responsibility than men do. Teaching is one of them. Women can often be found in the civil service as well. But yeah, the debate in education, the concerns about boys falling behind in secondary education are real and widespread in certain parts of Europe. Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a little philosophical question.
Can you identify?
My name is Hiro Krishna, and I'm with the Kokumin Shimbun editorial writer. Maybe I'm getting older, and maybe because I'm conservative, I think that society in the past, when Japanese men earn a lot, and husband give all the money to wife holds the purse string and control the money, and man work, and man gets a certain allowance. Maybe let's say nowadays, $20,200 or so for monthly allowance to buy lunch and so on. That kind of society may not be so bad to women as well. So in some society, rather poor, men and women both must work. Double income is necessity. But if single income is enough for a family, that family may not be as bad as those family who needs as a requisite double income.
Okay.
one of the things is that men go out, have pursued education, have gone through university, and then pursue a career and get the money, which they, as you say, hand over. But of course, what has changed is that women now have gone through education system as well, and they don't see, and I can understand that, as to why they should be the one who stays at home. They want to make use of the skills they have learned at school and at university. So that's where the story has changed. And I mean, for individual couples, it is up to them how they align their responsibilities. But in the greater macroeconomic perspective, the great education, the great gains in educational attainment among females has changed their happiness, so to speak, with the male breadwinner model. What you see in some countries is that men are going to work shorter hours. There is a better sharing. There's a lot of men who work part-time in the Netherlands. And you will also, and I think you will see that increasingly in European countries, is that women will be the one in the household who bring in most of the money. And that, I think, will generate even more change. When it becomes normal or frequent that the female partner brings in most of the money, that's when you will see a lot of change, because the male breadwinner model persisted because from an economic perspective it made total sense that women withdrew from the labor force when children arrived because they had the lower earnings. So from an economic perspective, if they left work, the income loss to the household was smallest. So that made perfect sense. Women were always marrying older men. They were more likely to earn more. Of course, if that changes, if women start to date younger men, but not only that, women are now more likely to have higher educational attainment. So even if they date someone of the same age, they may well end up earning more. And then it will change the bargaining dynamics in the household, because the women will say, "But hang on, I make more money." It makes much more sense if you reduce your working hours than I do, and that's when the dynamics will change even further. So, but that's philosophizing at the end of a press conference.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just ask the last question. In Asia Pacific, where do you think has been the most, the biggest progress in gender equality? I know there's different sectors like health and education, but in general, because Asia Pacific is the fastest economically growing region as well. So do you see that linked to the gender equality in any particular country?
Ooh, there's so many. Asia Pacific is such a diverse region. There are countries where very little progress has been made, and then I think about certain southern Asian countries like Pakistan. There are countries where much more progress has been made. I mean, Thailand, but also if you look at when you look at educational outcomes, Korea has made enormous changes. You see changes in Australia and New Zealand. I think that Japan is just at the beginning of seeing huge changes to the labor market. They may have seen changes already to what has happened in education, but I think the change in the labor market will come in the next few years.
Okay, if that is all, no more questions? One more? Yes, please.
My name is Rin Ichino from Bloomberg News. You talked about like changing culture, culture at working place is important, and I was wondering how do you estimate or evaluate the Prime Minister Abe's policies to bring more women to senior management position? Like, do you think that kind of policy would work for changing culture at workplace? Thanks.
Yes, but not instantaneously. Changing a culture, changing a workplace culture takes a long time. As I said at the beginning of the press conference, when I did Babies and Bosses, and when we said, listen, you know, the whole issue of fertility is not just related to childcare or to the tax benefit system or to the cost of education. It is also related to the limited opportunities of women at the labor market. People were looking at us, this is weird. What are these guys saying? Nowadays, there's a much better, much wider understanding that work-life balance issues have an effect on fertility, and that workplace cultures has an effect on happiness at home, on the birth rate, on gender equality. So that's a change. Like I said, governments across the OECD, and around the world for that matter, are reluctant but also less powerful to change labor market institutions. So by necessity, almost, measures are of a promotive nature, are encouraging, are trying to stimulate rather than describe change tomorrow. Governments find that very hard to do in the labor market institutions. So the labor market institutions have to change themselves, and employers change if they have a business case. The business case is becoming more clear, both from the terms of, both from the perspective of the demographic change. Also, there's a whole talent pool, very well-educated talent pool out there, which is underused. That's not smart economics. Entrepreneurs know that. And so that might generate change. And yeah, though you will, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, I wasn't expecting the Prime Minister of Japan to say the things he's saying now. That's progress, and now it is time to translate that into the attitudes of senior management and middle management in companies and in the labor market.
All right, thank you very much. And this is, well, a kind of appreciation.
Okay.
And you can be a member of our club for 1 year.
For 1 year?
Yes.
I have to
So
come back.
please come back again.
Yeah,
yes.
All right.
Thank
you very much indeed.
Thank you for coming.